I was never a favorite son. My parents always considered me lazy, a loser, and a person with no future. I was a poor student, not because I was stupid, but because I never saw the point in what was thrust upon us at school. After graduation, I tried various part-time jobs, as a courier in a warehouse and handing out flyers. I only had enough money for food and small change. At home, I was constantly reproached. My mother said I was a disgrace to the family, my father called me a burden, and my sister only joked that at 30, I would still be living off my parents. I tried to ignore it, but it was crushing. Every day I heard that no one needed me, that I would amount to nothing. I kept silent, but inside I was angry. I lived modestly, occasionally allowing myself to buy a lottery ticket just to feel some hope. Usually the tickets were empty at most, I won small change. But one day, everything changed. It was an ordinary day. I was returning from work at the warehouse, bought a ticket out of habit, and didn't even think anything would come of it. That evening, I turned on the TV to check the results. When I realized all the numbers matched, the piece of paper trembled in my hands. I had won tens of millions of rubles. I couldn't believe it. I sat with that ticket, reviewing the numbers, comparing them, until I realized it was impossible to make a mistake. I didn't sleep that night. I wondered what would happen next, how to spend the money, and whether it was even worth telling anyone about it. But it was hard to hide. In the morning, I told my family. My mother was the first to know. At first, she didn't believe me, then asked to see the ticket. When she was convinced, her face changed. Yesterday, she had said I was lazy and would never achieve anything, but now she was smiling and stroking my shoulder as if she were proud. My father put down the newspaper, came over, and said he always knew I would succeed, that I had just been searching for my path for a long time. My sister screamed that it was unbelievable and immediately started asking me what I'd buy first. I looked at them, confused as to why they despised me the day before and suddenly become so solicitous today. Within an hour, the conversations had begun. My mother said she'd long dreamed of a nice mink coat, and now she'd have the chance. My father started talking about a new car, as his old one was falling apart, and now he'd be able to drive like a real person. My sister declared that it was time to stop wasting her life in an old apartment, that it was time to buy a spacious place, and of course that she needed her own room. I listened in silence. No one asked what I wanted, what I was thinking, or what I was planning. It was as if they'd forgotten that it was my money, not the family's. That evening, my mother set the table, although she usually didn't even cook if I brought groceries. This time, she made dinner, smiled, and told the neighbors over the phone that she had the most successful son. My father poured himself some cognac and toasted how our family would finally rise from its knees. My sister was browsing real estate websites, showing me apartments she thought would be perfect. I sat in the corner, feeling like a stranger. It was like a dream. Just yesterday they were calling me worthless, and today they were a loving family. But there was no joy for me in their eyes. There was only calculation. They saw money, not me. A couple of days later, my mother was taking me shopping, showing me expensive fur coats and telling me I had to buy her the best one. My father mentioned car dealerships at every opportunity, saying that a decent man should drive a good car, which meant a son should take care of the family. My sister argued about which neighborhood would be the best place to spend the money on an apartment, and even hinted that I could register the property in her name, since I would have time to earn money later. I tried to explain that I wanted to think it through, that there was no point in spending so quickly, but no one listened. They said I was ungrateful, that without them I would never have managed. Although I remembered perfectly well that all these years they had only humiliated me and never supported me. But now they had the opportunity to live off me, and they suddenly became caring and kind. I felt trapped. If I agreed to their demands, they would quickly spend all the money. If I refused, they would hate me again, only with even greater intensity. I tolerated their hints and demands for a long time, but at some point I realized that if I didn't defend my boundaries now, my whole life would turn into an endless service to their whims. After I received the winnings in my account, I deliberately didn't disclose the exact amount, so as not to give them a precise idea of the scale. But even without that, they made plans as if they already had the right to dispose of millions. I decided that the first thing I would do was withdraw a small amount, buy myself a decent laptop and some clothes, and go on a couple of weeks' vacation in another country. I never traveled. At most, I went to a neighboring city. I wanted to see the world and be alone to think things through. When I told my mother this, her expression changed. She snapped that this was stupid, that I should take care of my family first and then myself. My father supported her and began explaining that a man is obligated to respect his parents, and money is a chance to prove his devotion. My sister threw a tantrum, as if I was trying to steal something from them. She screamed that I was selfish, that I only thought about myself, and that normal brothers provide for their families first and then spend on their own whims. I tried to explain that this wasn't a whim, that I needed time and space to figure out my plans. But no one listened. My mother said that if I left, I might as well never come back, because that's not what a normal son does. My father stood up, slammed his fist on the table, and demanded to see the bank statements so he could see how much money was in the account. He said the family needed to know what resources they had, and that I was acting suspiciously. My sister threatened to tell all the relatives that I had become greedy, so they would put collective pressure on me. I realized the conversation was pointless. That same night, I packed my things and went to a friend's place without telling anyone. The morning I went to the bank, withdrew some money and bought a trip abroad. My parents and sister started calling nonstop. The messages poured in one after another. First, they wrote requests, then threats. My mother wrote that if I did this, I was breaking her heart. My father threatened to go to court and demand that the winnings be recognized as family property. My sister promised to tell everyone she knew about my greed. I turned off my phone. For the first time in my life, I felt free. In a foreign country, I could calmly walk the streets, sit in cafes where no one reproached me, look at people who knew nothing about me. For the first time, I felt like I had a life I could manage myself. But this feeling didn't last long. A week later, emails from my mother and sister began arriving. They begged me to come back, wrote that they missed me, that the family was falling apart without me. I saw the falsehood in every word. They didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't inquire about my plans, but only reminded me that I had to help. My mother even sent a shopping list of things she was expecting: a fur coat, gold jewelry, new furniture. My father sent links to car dealerships. My sister demanded a down payment for the apartment she had already chosen. Their greed knew no bounds. I stopped answering, but they wouldn't calm down. When I returned to the country, my parents were waiting for me at the door. My mother cried, hugged me, told me she loved me and that she had been very worried. My father pretended to be happy to see me, but there was anger in his eyes. They immediately started talking about money. I said I wanted to live separately. My mother screamed that I had no right to abandon my family, that she had raised me my whole life, and now I had to repay her. My father said that if I left, I would no longer be a son. My sister threw another tantrum, demanding that the apartment be registered in her name because life was hard for her too. When I refused, they resorted to blackmail. My father said he'd tell everyone I'd stolen money from him. My mother threatened that if I didn't help, she'd have a heart attack and it would be my fault. My sister said she'd commit suicide if I didn't buy her a house. They were pressuring me from every angle, leaving me no choice. I stood there and felt everything crumble inside me. Yesterday I was a loser to them, today I was their wallet. They didn't even try to hide the fact that they didn't want me but the money. And in that moment, I realized I'd never had a real family. It was only an illusion I'd created for myself. After that conversation, the atmosphere at home became tense. My parents stopped hiding their irritation, but outwardly they tried to maintain the appearance of concern, especially my sister. She changed her tactics, stopped yelling and making a scene, and began to act softly. She began approaching me with a smile, bringing me tea, asking questions she'd never asked before. She suddenly started asking how I was doing at work, how I was feeling, and offered to help with small things. But I could tell it wasn't concern, it was just a game. I knew perfectly well she had a goal. One evening, she told me she wanted to introduce me to some friends who supposedly knew about investments and could help me save money. I was wary, but pretended to be interested. She assured me that these people were smart, serious, had been in business for a long time, and would tell me exactly where to invest so my money wouldn't go to waste. I saw impatience in her eyes. She tried to appear sincere, but every word she said betrayed something, because she had never thought about my future or about the safety of my money before. I agreed to meet to see what they were up to. On the appointed day, my sister brought 2 guys and a girl. They were about my age, dressed stylishly but overly flashily. the way people who want to appear rich but are actually living on the last ounce of their money like to dress. They introduced themselves as partners in a company supposedly involved in construction projects and real estate investments. They spoke confidently, gestured a lot, and showed photos on their phones of houses and offices they supposedly had built. I listened and noted inconsistencies. They were too eager to persuade me, repeating the words profitable and guaranteed too often. One of them said I had a unique chance to invest in a project that would double my income within 6 months. I smiled, feigned interest, asked questions, but inside my stomach turned cold. I knew they were scammers, and my sister was either in cahoots with them or too naive to believe their words. After they left, my sister immediately began convincing me that this was an opportunity I couldn't miss, that if I invested even part of the money, I could quickly earn even more and fulfill all my family's dreams. She spoke passionately, as if this were her project. I asked how she knew these people. She hesitated and replied that they were acquaintances through friends, that she trusted them, and that they were good people. But from her look, it was clear she was hiding something. A few days later, they came again, this time bringing some printouts, contracts without seals or signatures, detailing the investments and income. I took the papers and said I'd think about it. They pressed me, saying I needed to decide quickly because the project was closing and wouldn't happen without my participation. I saw my sister's nervousness, her glances at me, hopping I'd agree. After they left, I went online and started checking the information. There was no company by that name, and the photos they were showing were taken from other websites. I finally realized they were scammers. The only question that remained was whether my sister was their victim or an accomplice. The next day, I decided to check her out. I said I was willing to invest, but I wanted to visit the site first and see the construction. Her face changed. She tried to convince me it was unnecessary, that they were serious people, and that I simply didn't trust them. I persisted, and she started getting angry. Then I realized she knew everything and was in on the scheme. She screamed at me that I was suspicious, that because I didn't trust her, I was missing out on a chance, that she had worked so hard for me, and I was insulting her with my doubts. My parents sided with her. My mother said I had to trust my sister, that she wanted the best for me. My father said that if I didn't invest, I would regret it for the rest of my life, and my family would never forgive me for the missed opportunity. They surrounded me and pressed me from all sides, but I remained silent. I said I would make a decision later. The next day, I packed my things and moved out again, rented an apartment, and cut off all contact. I knew they wouldn't stop now. The scammers would come back, my sister would beg, my parents would demand. And if I gave in, I would lose everything. But the worst part was something else. I realized that my own sister was ready to drag me into a scam for money, that for her, I wasn't a brother but simply a way to profit. I sat alone in an empty apartment and felt that my life had changed completely. I had money, but I had lost my family, and that was the most bitter thing. After I stopped answering calls and finally refused to discuss the scam with my sister's people, chaos erupted at home. I was no longer living with my parents, but news reached me very quickly. They began to act in concert, as if they had forgotten all their previous quarrels and grievances and united for one goal, to portray me as a traitor. My mother began first. She called every relative, from close aunts to distant cousins we hadn't seen in years. She told me I'd gone crazy over money, that I'd lost respect for my parents, that I'd become secretive and suspicious. In her stories, I sounded like someone who had not only betrayed my family, but also thought of himself as superior to everyone else. She cried into the phone, sobbing, saying her heart couldn't take it, that the son she'd raised had turned into a monster who cared only about money. My relatives, who'd never been particularly interested in my life, immediately believed me, because my mother knew how to appeal to my pity. My father went further. He began visiting acquaintances, neighbors, and even his colleagues. There, he said I'd completely turned my back on my family, that I no longer recognized them as my parents, that I wanted to leave them with nothing. He added that they were the ones who raised me, provided a roof over my head, and I'd repaid them with base ingratitude. He spoke confidently, without tears, but with such hurt in his voice that people began to sympathize. They didn't know the truth, and of course, they sided with my parents, because in the eyes of society, they were the victims. My sister joined in from the other side. She posted on social media about how money had corrupted people, how her brother had betrayed the family for his wealth, and how she no longer had a brother. She posted childhood photos of us together and captioned them as if I were dead to her. Many of her friends started writing her words of support, offering sympathy, saying that people like me always end badly. Gradually, this began to spread, and people who didn't even know me began talking about me. On the street, I caught the glances of neighbors who had previously simply said hello, but now looked at me like an enemy. Several times, people approached me and started asking questions. Was it true that I kicked my parents out of the apartment? Was it true that I refused to help my mother? Was it true that I had millions and didn't want to give them to anyone? The more I tried to explain that it was a lie, the less they listened to me. My reputation was already ruined. One day, I went to a store near my parents' house, and the saleswoman, who had known us for many years, coldly said that she didn't expect this from me. I realized I'd been accused of something I hadn't done, and that my words meant nothing against the family's united front. The pressure grew stronger with each passing day. Relatives started messaging me, some reproachful, some threatening. They said that if I didn't help my parents, they would curse me, that I'd be left alone, that everyone would turn their backs on me. One cousin wrote outright that if he had that kind of money, the first thing he'd do was buy my parents a house, and I, he said, had lost my conscience. In everyone's eyes, I became a monster. I knew my family had done this deliberately to force me to give in. They knew social pressure was stronger than direct demands. They weren't satisfied with my money. They wanted me to feel guilty and come to them myself. The situation reached the point where rumors began circulating at work. Coworkers whispered that I'd won millions, but was greedy even with my family. Several people directly asked me why I was doing this, and when I tried to explain that it was wrong, they looked at me with disbelief. I found myself in a situation where every word was taken against me. My parents continued to push their agenda. My mother began visiting doctors and complaining about her health, saying that her son had brought her to tears, and now she had a heart condition. The doctors sympathized, then relayed her words to their friends. My father said he was ready to forgive me if I changed and remembered my duty to my family. My sister threw hysterics online, posting new photos and describing how hard it was to live with a traitor. I read all of this and felt the ground shift from under my feet. I found myself alone against the entire world, where even those closest to me had become enemies. And the most terrifying thing was that many believed them, not me. When I realized I no longer expected anything from them, I realized how deep the hypocrisy ran in this family. My parents, who had spent years calling me lazy and worthless, now spoke of love and care. But their words were staged, cheaply staged, designed to create the image of victims in order to coax everything they could out of me. My mother, who had never indulged in a single unnecessary purchase and constantly nagged me over every little thing, suddenly began demanding fur coats, jewelry, and new furniture as if the items were rightfully hers, not bought by someone else. She cried on the phone in front of relatives, feigning pain and helplessness, while simultaneously engaging in instant messaging conversations about which sofas were the best and the terms for getting a loan, all of this in unison, and without a twinge of conscience. The father, who for years had allowed himself only reproaches and sarcasm, now spoke of honor and duty, and from the heights of sudden moral superiority, demanded a new car and repairs to everything that was rightfully due to him. And in these conversations, there was not an ounce of shame for the past years of indifference. My sister, who had previously laughed at my plans in public and considered my dreams a waste of time, became a model protector of the family, bringing in people she assured would help us save money. Her smile became a tool, her words pressure. She brought her friends, introducing them as business people with successful projects and noble intentions. But her unbearably joyful manner betrayed the calculation and thrill of the hunt, as if my lottery win were not a cause for celebration, but simply a means to fulfill her personal whims. They called relatives and portrayed me as a monster abandoning my family, and my mother recounted in detail stories of my corruption and callousness, and people believed her because they were ready to believe a simple, convenient story. There is the rich man, and there are those who suffer from his greed. They weren't shy about inventing illnesses and exaggerating their needs. They taught each other pitying rhetoric to achieve a crowd-pulling effect. I was disgusted to watch how easily they rewrote the past, erasing their own mistakes and casting themselves as victims. But it was advantageous to them, and advantageous meant it was permitted. Every tear they shed was calculated to appeal to a witness, every complaint to a listener willing to back up the accusations. They gathered an army of supporters around them. An aunt, a neighbor, my father's colleague, a store clerk. Everyone had a role and a script. My sister acted like a director. One moment she'd hug me pitifully, the next she'd whisper to someone in the kitchen, the next she'd loudly rant on social media, hyping up friends' comments and creating a picture in which I was the main villain. My mother recorded pompous voicemails and sent them to groups. My father personally visited acquaintances and told them the truth. Things that never happened, and together they crafted a version that suited their own needs. It's not so much the brazenness itself that's astonishing, but the ease with which they reshaped reality. Years of indifference were erased, convenient episodes were attributed to me, and their own misdeeds were left behind the scenes. They unleashed a whole machine of public condemnation, and this machine operated without shame. In some conversations, pity flowed; in others, anger, all to keep people from asking unnecessary questions. I was amazed at how quickly family, friends, and even distant relatives accepted their words at face value, because the story was laconic and emotionally charged, difficult to dissuade with facts. I tried to explain, show documents, point out forgeries and schemes, but in response all I heard were, "You were found out when the money appeared. You became different. You forgot who fed you." And these people found it easier to believe a simple and vivid narrative than to consider that they had become participants in a pre-planned pressure operation. The house, which was supposed to be a refuge, now played out as a stage where everyone was an actor and never forgot their role. My mother learned to dramatize, my father to rationalize and persuade, my sister to manipulate social media and acquaintances. Their postures and remarks were equally vile. An appropriate tear in public, a heartfelt message in a chat, feigned fatigue, and endless hints of debt. They used old family stories as weapons, twisting the facts to appear compassionate and me, shameless. What made it even more nauseating was that all these scenes were staged as if in defense of family values, supposedly exalting morality above materialism, when in reality, morality was merely a mask for theft. They spoke clever words about honor and duty, and in their mouths, these words became a weapon of pressure, because behind them lay one simple idea: money is more important than strong relationships, and appearance and the opinions of others are more important than the truth. I saw how easily they deceived themselves and others, as if they had no internal compass, only economic calculation. My sister would write posts in the morning about the value of family, and by evening she would arrange behind-the-scenes negotiations with those who promised to help with investments and concessions. My mother would discuss my supposed mistakes on social media, and the next day she would go to the neighbors asking, not to judge my son, but to help him understand the right thing to do. Their duplicity was so blatant that it tore me apart. I didn't want to argue, I wanted to scream, but my voice was drowned out by the torrent of their carefully crafted complaints. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a cynical, cold, systematic exploitation of family ties for personal gain, and the more I tried to resist, the more convincing and brutal their campaign became. Every new call, every new family gathering was skillfully orchestrated and served one purpose: to make me feel so guilty that I would throw myself at the mercy of the likely empty people who had suddenly become the guardians of family values. Their hypocrisy didn't hide in small details. It spread like poison to everything around me, to friends, to neighbors, to colleagues, to the saleswoman at the store. I was sickened by the fact that the people who were supposed to be my support turned out to be traitors in human emotions, and the most disgusting thing was that many chose to believe them without asking the simple question: why did all this only begin after the money arrived? They had destroyed trust not with words, but with a series of premeditated actions, and this truth made it even more bitter, because they hadn't just robbed me of a peaceful life. They had robbed me of the illusion of family, an oasis where I could find refuge. These were actors now, not people, and this realization was poisonously painful. They lived like fish in water in a dense tangle of lies and feigned grief, and the more I looked into their faces, the more clearly I saw. Behind their kindness and pity lay a paltry emptiness that they were trying to fill with my money, without the slightest twinge of remorse. I realized that staying here was no longer possible. Every encounter, every glance, every word in this city had become toxic to me. Even the air seemed saturated with lies, hypocrisy, and envy. I felt like a cornered animal, even though I was the one who had won, the one who had been lucky, the one who had been given a chance at a new life, but luck had become a chain to which I was tied. And those who called themselves my family held me by this chain. I hesitated for a long time, considering whether to simply disappear without a word, leaving them all to stew in their own lies, but then I realized that would be too easy for them. They would remain pure in the eyes of society, they would continue to play the victim, and I would forever remain the monster who abandoned my parents. I couldn't let myself go like that, so I began preparing to leave, but simultaneously collecting everything they had left behind. I began recording calls, saving screenshots of messages in which they openly divided my money, discussed schemes, and devised new ways to pressure me. I recorded their words when they forgot to turn off speakerphone, and I heard my mother dictating to her sister what to write in her next post. I even recorded the moment where my father told an acquaintance that my mother wasn't ill, but she needs to embellish it so that they feel more sorry for her. This evidence was filed in a folder that over time became thicker than any family album. I collected everything in a separate archive, made several copies, uploaded it to the cloud, and prepared it for distribution. Every detail, every mask they wore was exposed in these documents. The day before I left, I went to their house. I didn't go inside, didn't want to see their faces, but I left the envelope in the mailbox. Inside was a letter and a flash drive. In the letter, I wrote everything I thought, without embellishment. I reminded them how they called me lazy, how they were ashamed of me in front of the neighbors, how they suddenly remembered love when they had money. I described how they wove a web of lies, how they traded their grief for pennies of approval, and how easily they betrayed the only person who still believed in family. I wrote that I was not greedy or unscrupulous, that I would help them if it were sincere, but I was not obligated to feed those who were ready to tear me apart for their own greed. I wrote that I was leaving and they would never see me again, but instead of silently disappearing, I was leaving them with what they feared most: the truth. The flash drive contained all the recordings, and in the letter I indicated that copies were already in the hands of several people and in the cloud. I warned them. If they continued their campaign against me, if anyone tried to paint me as a monster again, I would press a button and the whole truth would be made public. I wasn't threatening, I was simply stating a fact, and that made my words even harder. As I left, I saw a shadow flicker in the window. One of them had noticed me. I didn't stop. The road, freedom, a new life awaited me, and for the first time in all this time, I felt not fear but relief. I understood that from that moment on, their mask had cracked. They could continue to lie, but at any moment their lies could turn against them. I had deprived them of their most important weapon: control. I had robbed them of their confidence in my silence and patience. Now they knew I could see right through them, and that any step they took could be the last in their charade. I boarded the train, looked out the window at the fleeing city, and thought about how strange it all had turned out. The money that could have saved me had destroyed me. The people who should have been my support had turned out to be my executioners. But I still had one thing they would never have: freedom. They were shackled by their lies, their fear of exposure, their insatiable greed. And I was riding toward the unknown, but this unknown was purer and more honest than the life they were trying to force upon me. I was riding to a place where my name wouldn't be tarnished by their stories, where I could breathe without the weight of judgment, where I could be myself. And if they ever decided to lay hands on me again, I knew I'd always have a weapon: their own hypocrisy, etched in documents, in their voices, in their words. I gave them a chance to shut up and live in peace, but knowing them, I knew that sooner or later they'd make their move again, and then I'd be ready. As I began to adjust to my new life in a different city, it seemed like the past was gradually receding. I rented a small apartment, tried to keep a low profile, not to brag about my winnings, even changing my appearance. I got a haircut, changed my style of clothing, bought simpler clothes so as not to stand out. I worked on relearning to trust people, and even began to believe that there really might be something bright ahead. But the past refused to let go. I ignored the first calls from unfamiliar numbers, but soon I started receiving messages in instant messaging from people I didn't know. They hinted that they knew who I was, that they'd heard about my winnings, that they knew where I'd moved. At first, I thought it was just more gossip, but then I noticed that someone was actually following me. A car outside the entrance, identical faces on the street, repeated glances in the crowd. And then I realized it wasn't a coincidence. They had found me. Later, I learned that it was my sister who had decided to intervene again. Having failed to get her share through parents and rumors, she went further and turned to those very friends who had offered schemes and investments. She decided to play on fear and blackmail, convincing the scammers that she had access to part of my money, that my brother was weak and would give in if pressured. For her, it was just another game. Portray herself as the victim, accuse me of cruelty, and get her way through other people. She wasn't fazed by the fact that these people were dangerous, that their methods were far from harmless. She thought she could control them the same way she controlled the opinions of her relatives and neighbors. But she miscalculated. I learned of her plans by chance when one of these helpers contacted me himself. He introduced himself as an old family friend, saying that my sister had asked him for a heart-to-heart talk, saying everything could be resolved quietly without unnecessary fuss. But the longer he talked, the clearer it became. It was blackmail. They offered to hand over some of the money to settle the matter with the family. Otherwise, they promised to spread incriminating evidence, cause problems in my new place, and make my life a living hell. I listened and realized that this wasn't a threat from outsiders. It was my own sister's doing. She picked up the dolls again and started pulling strings, only now instead of relatives, it was people profiting from others' fear. I mustered all my strength not to panic. I started recording the conversation. I saved the correspondence. I gathered everything I could as evidence. This time, I was prepared. I told them I had documents, that I had connections, that any action they took would be the end not for me, but for them. I hinted that my archives had already been sent to several places, and that if they took a single step, everything would end up in the hands of the police and the press. And I saw the confidence on the other end of the line fading. Scammers are used to frighten people, but I spoke coldly and calmly, and this broke them. They tried to stall for time, they made threats, but soon they backed out. But my sister didn't stop. She started writing to me herself, accusing, crying, threatening, saying that if I didn't give in, then you can't even imagine what awaits you. Her messages were as hypocritical as before, first sweet, then hysterical, then angry. I looked at those lines and realized that the person I considered close had vanished completely. Before me was a predator, ready to hand my brother over to criminals for the sake of profit. She didn't care that she could put me in danger, that she could destroy my life completely. She didn't care. To her, I wasn't a brother, but a bag of money to be split, and the sooner the better. But this time, her plan failed. The scammers, realizing that I wasn't a frightened guy, but a man with evidence and a tough stance, retreated. And with that, they turned their backs on her. Her game was over, and she was left with nothing. I imagined her sitting at home, her parents desperately trying to understand why nothing had worked out again, how they blamed each other, how my sister made excuses and looked for someone to blame other than herself. I imagined their faces, full of anger, but now powerless, because all their trump cards had been knocked out of them. I realized that nothing kept me with them anymore. I no longer had to prove my case. I no longer had to tolerate their hypocrisy. They themselves had shown that they were ready to betray, slander, sell, and use. I always thought that nothing could be worse than their greed and pressure. But now I realized that what was worse was their ability to lie to themselves, to feign love, to cover up their hatred with beautiful words. They turned out to be far more terrible than I had imagined. I believed that somewhere deep inside them there remained at least a drop of realness. But now I saw a void that could no longer be filled by anything. Family died for me the moment my sister decided to sell me to strangers for money. Everything that had been childhood, memories, rare moments of warmth, turned out not to be real, but a decoration that collapsed at the first opportunity. I closed my phone, deleted her messages, and for the first time in a long time felt relief. I realized that I no longer had a family, but I still have myself. And unlike them, I still have my soul.